Well, welcome, Paul, to the Fire Next Time, to the inaugural Fire Next Time podcast.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So today is what? March 22nd, 23rd, exactly 2 months after the lockdown in Wuhan. These are uncertain times. So yeah, I'm really glad you took the time to chat. We might as well start out with an intro because I think you had a really interesting career, definitely spanning over a lot of different geographies. I believe you've been on the NSC, you've worked at a bank, you've worked in Japan, I believe, for a long time. Can you just kind of give us an intro and talks about your background?
Yeah, so I lived in Washington for a while, and I worked in the executive branch and in the congressional branch and in the judicial branch, all three
Wow.
branches of the government. And in the executive branch was the NSC, and came to Asia. I worked in banking and research most of my career in Hong Kong, Indonesia, Singapore, some time in Japan, and focused a lot on China and basically started doing research in China in 1992 when I was at Credit Suisse.
Wow. Wow. And what do you do now? So you're residing in Singapore right now, which thank God is handling this virus quite well. And yeah, what are you up to these days?
Well, it's handling it quite well. It's doing a great job in terms of doing the blocking and tackling of locating, communicating, testing, and then also really getting to the point of isolating people and making sure that clusters don't break out, and contact tracing. So they're doing a very good, very detailed job, and Singapore's taken this very, very seriously right from the get-go. So basically, everybody in the Singapore government is all hands on deck for 2 months. I know some people who work inside the Ministry of Defense here, and they've been basically working 7 days a week for 2 months,
Wow.
trying to keep this thing from getting out of hand. And Singapore had about 100 cases, and people were getting a little bit more relaxed. And then the cases pretty much had gone up to almost 450 now. And so there's been
Wow.
a more serious crackdown in the last couple of days. And so basically, anybody who's come in for the last 14 days is on an automatic 14-day quarantine, voluntary quarantine at home. It's called a stay-home notice, which I think we're going to hear a lot more about. And today, they basically banned any short-term visitors. Any people coming in here for tourism for 30 days or less are not coming in. And so, as
Really?
we all
Wow.
know now, in all countries in Asia, anywhere you go in Asia is a 14-day quarantine automatic. So basically, a lot of the intra-Asia travel has come to a halt unless you want to spend 14 days in a quarantine.
Wow. Yeah, it really seems like they're treating it like it's wartime in Singapore, which I think is the right way to do these kind of things.
Yeah, and you're seeing that language in the last 3 days. Finally, in Italy and Spain and even the United States now is talking in that language, and I think there's less of a the U.S. Always has had an institutional sort of distrust of the Army, basically inside domestic borders. But I think the Army Corps of Engineers and the Army medical staff is going to have to help out, because I think we're going to get a lot of cases in places like New York, Los Angeles, other large metropolitan cities.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think we have a lot to talk about today. I mean, I think the world being the way it is before the virus, there was a lot to talk about anyway, but definitely now it's really thrown a huge self-replicating wrench into the whole thing. So, so I get your newsletter. I'm a big fan of it. I really like how informative it is. I think it's very data-based, and I also really like how quickly you react to things. I think the last 2 weeks I've gotten like 10 emails from you, and each one was completely different. Each one was a different theme in this whole kind of global, whatever the hell is happening right now. So I just want to read a few points from an email you sent less than a week ago, titled "High Importance: How to Get Out of This Mess." And so you talk about how there's three major bullets that are in the financial market. So there's the COVID virus in China from January There's the oil price war going on between, Russia and Saudi Arabia going on right now. And then there's the COVID spread throughout Spain, throughout Europe and the US. And obviously this week, and the past few days, there's been major action by a number of central banks. So I guess just to tackle these, one by one, let's start with, I think, kind of the most recent, which is, what's your view on the various kind of central banking measures being taken? Do you think that it's going to be enough for the virus, and what do you think the after effect is going to be once we get over the hump?
So I think that I've come to the conclusion over the weekend that this is far more serious than the GFC in 2008. And essentially, what you have seen happening in the last week is four sets of debt markets have sort of blown up. Call it the ABC market. The A market is the AA companies that are very good. The triple B market is sort of the okay companies that are in danger of being downgraded to junk. And then the C market is the junk. The fourth one is the municipal bond market, which is a very large market in the U.S. that the states use, individual states use the municipal bond market to fund those. All four of those have blown up. And so the Federal Reserve and the Congress and the executive branch are dealing with, four sets of bond markets that have all had their spreads blowing out. And so there is a general retreat from risk, not just in the equity market, but in the corporate debt market and in the state municipal bond market. So the Federal Reserve is really trying to fire all guns far more powerfully than 2008 to try to calm the markets and bring spreads down. Because if spreads stay this high for much longer, right, the amount of the interest rate that corporates are paying for their debt right now is very, very high. For instance, it's like 10%. Right now, corporates are paying 10%.
Wow.
To give you an example, the corporates in America that are sort of junk are paying higher interest rates than in Indonesia right now, right? So it's kind of crazy, right? And that's not sustainable. And so you have to get those rates down by offering help. And so last night, the Federal Reserve basically backstopped and guaranteed all the debt of the states. You had a $2 trillion package that's being discussed between the Republicans and Democrats in Congress. And I believe the Federal Reserve is going to do a lot more. And of course, last Thursday, the European Central Bank under Christine Lagarde basically agreed to buy up $1 trillion worth of corporate debt in Europe. I believe the Federal Reserve is going to have to do the same thing in America very soon. I think that's inevitable. So, and I think there's more to come. I think we have a very, very serious problem with a very large debt market, right? The debt market we're talking about is around 14 to 16 trillion dollars that we're talking about. That's sort of out of whack right now, and you got to get that back into sync.
Yeah, because I just remember less than a week ago the Fed put out its bazooka, and then it said we're not going to backstop commercial paper, and less than 48 hours later it was like, oh no, we changed our minds, we're going to backstop commercial paper. And I think one thing that is really striking to me is in 2001 we had a dot-com bubble. In 2008 we had the GFC, the so-called allegedly struck by the real estate bubble. And now, one word you've kind of seen thrown around the last few years has been everything bubble, where everything is kind of, overpriced. And so you kind of see that again with the Fed's response, where they're just kind of backstopping everything. They're saying, nothing's going to really, except for stocks so far, but they're really kind of just being, just trying to, well, in their words, provide liquidity for basically everything in the market. And so, well, I guess my question is, A, do you think even this kind of drastic measure is going to be enough? And because the other thing we talked about a lot, we did, but that was talked about a lot in 2008 was this moral hazard of just bailing out everything, of kind of distorting the market by not allowing bad trades to just default, or, just letting bad businesses, except Bayer and Lehman, a few others, not letting all of them go down. So what do you think the side effects are going to be? Do you think that the Fed is really going to distort the market to the point where, I don't know, where we have even more negative side effects than just letting it run its course?
Well, I think in general, the 2008 crisis was really a mortgage crisis. It was fundamentally a mortgage crisis where there was just, I would have to say that there was widespread fraud in the mortgage market. Probably about $1.5 to $2 trillion of fraudulent mortgages that should never have been offered to homeowners. Those were largely in Fannie Mae. And so what's interesting about 2008, 2009, which was smart, Fannie Mae was just put in, Fannie Mae is the federal, mortgage company that had a lot of the country's mortgages, and it was a quasi, government agency. And
Right.
so that was just basically put into receivership. This one is more difficult. This one, I think, I kind of agree with you that it's an everything bubble, but it's really specifically, this is a corporate bubble. This is a corporate debt bubble.
Bubble.
So we got to think of it as corporate debt. And so this is more difficult because for this very simple reason that the biggest part of the corporate debt is the triple B, and those are basically really at risk of being downgraded to junk, because when you lose your B status and you turn into C status, you become junk. Why is that important? It's important because when you become junk, like pension funds, university endowments, insurance companies cannot own your debt. They have to sell it. They're forced sellers. They can't own that. They cannot own non-investment grade debt. That they cannot own C debt. And guess what? A lot of the B debt that was in danger of being downgraded was all the companies that are mostly affected by the virus: airlines, entertainment, hotels, gaming, casinos, theater companies. Right? These are the companies, unfortunately, that were very concentrated in that triple B stuff that was in danger of being downgraded. So there's two things happening here, right? So these companies are on the verge of being downgraded, so people have to sell them, and their businesses are terrible, right? And they're in deep trouble with cash flow issues. And that's kind of what's going on. Is specifically you have a triple B problem. And these are all of your capital intensive cyclicals, right? And what the way I like to think about it is everything with a rudder, a tire, or a wing, right? Is the stuff that gets in bad trouble when these kinds of things happen. Cruise ships, they have rudders. Airlines, they have wings. The car companies are in terrible trouble right now, right? And then you can kind of stretch that to the hotel chains, the theater chains, and other entertainment companies. The movie theaters are in deep trouble. And so that's what's going on. And so that's what I think that the fiscal package that's being thrown back and forth with the Republicans and Democrats last night and today is probably looking at these very specific issues.
Right. That's really interesting because, with the GFC, we were talking about kind of how all these mortgages got packaged up into CDOs, and then
Yes.
they got packaged more CDOs, and then they got insurance via CDSs, and then these
Yes.
CDSs were crazy leverage, and that became this kind of atomic
Yes.
bomb at the heart of the financial system. But
Yes.
what you're saying is that these corporates have almost become, due to regulation that requires pension funds sell junk bonds from their portfolios. It's almost like these corporates, due to the real economy weakening and due to the massive amount of corporate debt, the unprecedented amount of corporate debt in the system, it's
Correct.
almost like this is its own kind of time bomb. It's not even about derivatives. This is just spot corporate bonds. And if they slide into junk, then it's going to cause obviously just huge amounts of debt going bad, and it could cause a ripple that goes all the way through the financial system, almost exactly like what happened in the GFC. And that's almost like a big reason why the Fed is getting so involved in these Main Street companies. Would you say all that is accurate?
Yes, completely accurate. And so I'll give you a quick summary of the discussion in the Senate today and going on tomorrow is exactly about this. And so basically the Republicans in power, want, their constituents are, wealthy, corporates. That's the way the system works. That's who represents Republicans. And so what you are seeing is essentially about a $2 trillion package, and about 1.5 trillion is going to go to mom and pop, $2,000 checks to families, unemployment benefits, and so forth. But the Senate Republicans want a $500 billion bailout, which they want a blank check to give this money to all the companies that we're talking about, the companies on the verge of either getting downgraded to junk or becoming deeply problematic, in terms of like sustaining their businesses. Companies like Boeing, GE, Delta, United, possibly major hotel chains, possibly large movie theater chains. The cruise ship companies are on the verge of going under. And so the Democrats said, forget it. That's a total non-starter idea. We're not going to give you a blank check to go and have this money just go out to the corporates in some secret deal. And so that's exactly the problem right now, and where the hang up is. And I believe, something that you and I talk about a lot, that the Democrats are very afraid that this is going to cause deep problems in the greater population, who are just so sick of, having the larger, corporates get bailed out, and then the little guy gets nothing. And so there's a hyper sensitivity here about how this is being done, and that's why they did not reach a deal last night, and why many of the markets today are in meltdown.
Yeah, geez. Yeah, I remember for TARP, or was it,
Yes.
I think the Obama stimulus actually, where they had it was like 798 billion, I think, and then 30 billion of that was loans for small business. And I was just like, wow, it's a really, I mean, I can appreciate how obviously larger businesses need more money, but I was like, this seems like a small amount of money for people who are really crucial to the real American economy. And by the way, that was a
Indeed.
deal.
Yeah, exactly. And nobody went to jail, and the banks were bailed out, and millions of Americans lost their homes. They didn't get any help. And so that caused a lot of the rage that got someone like Trump elected.
Yeah. And the really ironic and ridiculous part is that that bill was passed during a Democrat supermajority, right? So that was kind of their big chance. But I guess water under the bridge, right? It's a different time now. But
Well,
I just
yeah,
want
I was on a stage with Barney Frank a couple of years ago, and we were
to.
talking about this, and he was the one. The Dodd-Frank bill was basically what you're talking about, and he
Yeah.
was a very senior Democrat who organized a lot of this stuff. And he says his biggest regret of his career was not getting more people arrested back
Oh,
then.
oh, geez. Geez, yeah. So I got one more question about kind of macroeconomics, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff I want to talk about. But so, you see this thing of, like you mentioned, even if even if the Fed is able to prop up the corporate bond market and we don't have this bomb go off, you could still see anything with a wheel, a rudder, or a wing become, in your words, deeply problematic. Now, there's another word that I want to throw out there. I want to see if you can agree with to describe these corporations, and that's a zombie corporation. And so where a corporation is just kind of keeps, it's still technically alive, it's able to service its debt, but it's not really able to dig itself out of the hole. And I bring that up because you kind of saw these show up a lot in the 80s in Japan, where the BOJ kind of came in when the economy was going down and tried to save everything. And how these in Japan you have the concept of karetsu, where these large corporates are all kind of interlinked with each other, and how they just kind of lent each other money and kind of kept each other alive. And so you have, well, some would say you have a bunch of zombie corporations in Japan right now, which are not really financially viable, which are not really profitable in the real sense, but are still been kept on life support for 20 years and how deeply the central bank's involved. And obviously, you've seen stagflation in Japan for, well, not exactly stagflation, but stagnation in Japan for a pretty long time now. So, with the measures that the Fed is taking, do you see this being an outcome in America?
Oh, that's a good question. There's a couple of things that are very important here.
Mhm,
You know, when other countries which went through the GFC didn't manage themselves well, you know, they and during the Asian crisis as well in 1998. You know,
mhm,
they blew up. They had violent revolutions. They had a great deal of social instability. They've had decimated their healthcare systems and left, you know, the poor people to fend for themselves. You know,
mhm,
and they become utter basket cases. And the examples I would give you all over the place. You know, South Africa, Brazil,
mhm.
Argentina,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
Thailand. You know, and Thailand had a great deal of violence. I think
Mhm,
to some extent Indonesia went into a dark hole for, you know, 7 years.
mhm,
Japan has had not a single bullet fired in violence. It still has one of
mhm,
the lowest crime rates in the world. It still has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world. Life
mhm,
is pretty good. If you talk to somebody who's a worker, they will say, my salary's gone down 25%, but guess what? My daytime lunch has gone down by 50%.
mhm,
And I've always been struck by that because I've been teaching graduate students for 20 years. And I always ask the Japanese students to talk about their experience of deflation with the
mhm.
Chinese students next to them who have had nothing but inflation and higher
Right.
wages for 15 years. And the Chinese students, their jaws drop on the floor because they don't even know what deflation is because they've had a
Mhm.
booming economy for 20 years. Japan's had a
Yeah.
deflating economy for 20 years. This is terrible for young people because young people like to borrow and build businesses and, you know, get homes and start families. But quite
Mhm.
frankly, you know, what Japan has done has created a society which is still very cohesive.
Right.
And so we need to pay attention to some of these issues where, yes, they've allowed zombie corporations to exist. So does Europe. So does the
Right.
US. So does
Mhm.
Australia. So did everybody else. That's part of the way of getting out of a problem is to
Mhm.
sort of, you know, uh, move along slowly, try to bring as many people as you can with you, and try not to create chronic unemployment because chronic unemployment will kill your economy because you basically kick out an entire generation of young people who don't have any experience working. And by the time they're
Mhm.
30, they don't know what work is. This is really
Right.
problematic. So you want to have these periods of unemployment to be as low as possible. And so,
Right.
you know, there's a lot of, you know, there's going to be a lot of books written about this. I think the U.S. Tends to clean out quicker. It tends to clean the U.S. cleaned out the banks, and the banks took, you know, $1 trillion of losses. By
Mhm.
2009, some of the European banks have still not written off stuff from the GFC in 2008. It's still on their books. Deutsche Bank, right? Example.
Mhm.
And so the U.S. will tend to try to clean out the pain, and the U.S. will resort to socialist bailouts for sure, and the moral hazard that comes with it. But
Mhm.
I think there's a role to play for zombies.
Mhm.
We can go back and forth about this, but you know, Japan's a very peaceful society. Nothing was burned down, right? Nobody has been killed.
Mhm.
There's not guns all over the streets.
That's really interesting because I think you're saying two really interesting things there. Because on one side, you're saying almost saying that there's a role to play for zombie corporations, almost as a kind of capitalistic style social safety net
Correct.
and a way to
Exactly.
drive growth. That's really
Exactly.
interesting. That's like that's the most capitalistic way to implement a safety net ever. Just to have a money losing company and just have it employ people and have that be the way to, I mean, in a way to teach people how to get jobs, how to function inside what is still a capitalistic society, have the government be the backstop for that corporation. I think that's really interesting. And obviously it does work to some degree in Japan.
Yes, and
Um,
that's right. And so these companies that are paying 2% for their debt, that they're alive. If there was normalized interest rates, they would die, right? If interest rates were 6 or
right.
7, they would all close. But the interest rate is 1 or 2%, right? The government is funding itself at basically zero, right? So the
Right.
federal government of Japan can build an Olympic-sized swimming pool in every small town in Japan, which it has done, by the way, and they're no worse the wear. And Japan's debt to GDP is 200%. And the currency is one of the best performing currencies in the world. The debt market is one of the best performing debt markets in the world for the last 15 years, right? And
Right.
it's remarkable how people have just been either showing contempt or pity for Japan, but the social experiment has worked a hell of a lot better there than it has in places like other countries in Europe whose healthcare systems
Well,
have
like
been
Argentina,
decimated.
right? At least,
Argentina, Brazil,
you
even
know.
the American healthcare system has been decimated. And this is one of the
Yeah.
problems with COVID, is because all the federal funding for hospitals and healthcare is gone.
Yeah. 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 So that's a good point, because the other thing I wanna, what Japan has done is really, in its own way, quite impressive, to able to kind of come along such a long way with such low growth and such deflationary environment. And so, that's the other thing I want to ask you about, just when we bring up Japan, because I think it's so interesting, because you spent a long time in Japan. You know that as a culture, it's quite different from a lot of different cultures, and it really prides itself on not being different, but being unique in its own way. Japan has the oldest and the only unbroken monarchy in the world. The emperor has been around for over 1,000 years. The Japanese people, as you know, are very cohesive in their own way. And so, I say this because we're at a time, I think, of unprecedented, maybe not unprecedented, but of immense social discohesion in the US right now. And I think certainly prior to Trump's election, all this was already happening. So do you think this model is still possible in the US, even, given the cultural differences? Something you mentioned was not a single shot was fired, but there's a lot more guns in the US. Do you think that's going to make an impact?
Yeah, I think it's very problematic. I think that I'll give you some examples.
Mhm.
I just finished a book on this, which I
Bring
gave
your
to you.
camera
You've
up a little
read,
bit.
you reviewed it, and so I appreciate that. But
Mhm.
we're looking at the United States has more
Hey, Paul, I'm going to cut
guns.
you off 1 second, because right now it's like I can only see your nose and below. So yeah, so bring it up a little bit more.
Okay,
Yep, that's great. That's great.
okay,
Sorry
sorry
about
about
that.
that.
Mhm.
Because it's not what's showing in my screen. But
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So let me start again. I think that's right. And I just finished a book on this, and you were very kind to review the book.
Mhm.
America has more guns per capita than Yemen, which has been in a full blown civil war
Mhm.
for many years. And so in fact, the United States has more guns per capita than virtually any other country in the world. And so, yeah, that is problematic. There is a great deal of anger and rage. Particularly, I would have to say it's in the South.
Mhm.
And what's been happening last week? There was a lot of gun sales last week when people
Yeah.
began to sort of get a little bit edgy and nervous about this COVID thing. And
Mhm.
I know many people who would make some assumptions that there might be some violence in the future in the United States. There's no doubt
Mhm.
about it. Um, you know,
Right.
Domestic terrorism is a real problem in America. There's no doubt about that. And so
Mhm.
yeah, so yeah, the society is at war. American society is at war with itself. I have
Mhm.
never seen more disagreement and more vitriol and more vicious attacks on the left and the right in my lifetime than I've seen in the last year.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, geez. Well, so well, we'll see what happens with that one. That's going to be a well, I guess we'll just have to follow it and see how it goes, and how well US society can keep cohesion given what's going on. Um So I guess moving on from macroeconomics, but still on the topic of corporate debt. So, I want to talk about American Airlines for a little bit, kind of the whole airline industry, because they're, I think, a great example of or at least a great bellwether of how governments will react. So, American Airlines, they were in a very low interest debt environment for a long time, and they used a lot of that money to engineer buybacks. And
Yes.
so they've been hugely profitable for many years, and yet they still are incredibly financially fragile. And many people are very mad about that. Now, in your book, AI and Quantum Computing for Finance and Insurance, um, you talk a lot about how companies should be spending should be spending more on research. So things like like IoT, like AI, and how important they're going to be in the future. Now, I just want to bring up another point. Well, I guess to start off, do you think that American Airlines should have spent more on, for example, better customer service, better flights, retrofitting, research, instead of buybacks? Is just given everything we've seen so far, do you think that would have been prudent? Or do you think that would have been, and on the counterpoint to being financially prudent, do you think that would have been the most responsible thing for shareholders?
Yeah, of course. I know it's not just the airline companies. It's all of the Dow, most of the S&P
Hmm.
500. And not only
Hmm.
did they not spend cash, their cash flow on R&D, they borrowed money to buy back their stock. And so that's
Hmm.
great on the way up. But on the way
Hmm.
down, this is a big problem because when your stock price goes down, your bank calls you and says, "Hey, you know what? You borrowed that stock, with your you know, you borrowed that money with your stock at whatever $100, and now right now your stock's at whatever $60, and you got to repay some of this debt now. So the
Hmm.
unwind of this is really violent because not only are you dealing with your business slowing down, you have to pay back money to the bank, who's asking for a margin call, and the margin call is very clear. The contracts are very clear. If your stock goes down by such and such an amount, you have to, top up your account, right? You have to
Hmm.
go get cash from somewhere and top up your account. And this is happening throughout the entire system. And that's why there's
Hmm.
such a strain in the financial system in America, because there's a very big margin call on lower collateral prices.
Hmm.
And this debt was accumulated to buy back stock. So not
Right.
only so a cash flow was not being put aside to get R&D, and B, even worse, money was being borrowed to drive stock prices up by buying back their own stock. And why was
Hmm.
this? Because of a very stupid law which says your taxation on stock gains is going to be better than a tax liability on dividends. It was
Right.
really a bad, stupid law, but it
Hmm.
caused stock prices to keep going up because of stock buybacks.
Right.
And I think when we look back in history, that will be like, oh, that was really stupid. That was a really bad idea.
Hmm.
And there's lots of those things from 2008 from the GFC I won't go into that were really, really bad ideas that were policy.
Hmm.
And so you're exactly right that these companies spent too much of their cash, basically propping up their stock price because it was tax efficient,
Hmm.
rather than doing more R&D. And of course, Boeing is another example of that. Boeing stock went to $400. Boeing stock is now like I think in the 90s today.
Hmm.
So it's down like 80%, right? And
Right.
so you're exactly right. The stock buybacks rather than R&D is a terrible idea. And I work with the board of directors of a very large insurance company in America, and
Hmm.
one of the top people said it is terrible that we just spent $2 billion buying back our stock when there was 10 things that are better to do in terms of
Right.
investing in technology. But instead, we bought our stock, and
Right.
that's life. And so
That's life. Well, that is life, but at the same time, it's also that's the rational decision of executive decision makers based on policy, right? Because you have all these shareholders that want their stock to go up because then they get gains in their portfolio at the lowest tax rate. And
Correct.
if enough of them make noise, then it's going to happen. You're going to start buying your stock back.
Correct.
Um, so the reason I bring up American Airlines specifically and their stock buyback is there's a really great essayist I read called his name is Matt Levine with Bloomberg. I don't know if you read him, but he puts out a newsletter, and he kind of looks at what American Airlines did, and so this is his point. His point is that so American Airlines spent 15 billion over the last 10 years to buy its stock back. Now it could have spent that money on technology. However, given that no one is flying, it may not have helped during this crisis. It could have put all that money in a bank, and let's say it put 15 billion in the bank, and when this is over, let's say it spent it all. So the market cap at the end of 2019 for AA was 12.3 billion. So his point was, if you put 15 billion in the bank and you spent it to keep your business alive during a time when no one's flying, then you spent 15 billion to protect a 12.3 billion market cap. And he was like, I'm not sure I'm not immediately sure that's a good trade. And so his point was that, you know, by spending 15 billion to buy the stock back, it gave shareholders back like a over 100% return on their investment. And his point was that if you look at the various things AA could have done, then going all in essentially on stock buybacks was in a way the way that brought the highest shareholder return in a way. So, so what do you say about that? Because it almost comes back to this point of, well, there was a change in policy, and now this is the best way to return money to shareholders, and maybe that's the point of a public company, and that's obviously probably a major influence in why AA did what it did. So do you think that that's kind of the point, that just because it maximizes shareholder return, that it was the rational thing for American Airlines to do?
Well, yeah, that's exactly what we talk about in this book that I just finished, which I think is why China's ahead in so many of these sectors, because it has a long-term view and pours money into all these things, payments, e-commerce, digital currency, blockchain, autonomous cars, battery technology, quantum communications, on and on, where it is actually pulling ahead of the US, and where so many of these companies just were buying back their stock. I think that is, and I think there's a lot of very senior top portfolio managers who enjoy the capital gains, but have been grumbling, privately. That is a policy that is completely reckless, and will leave America, with high stock prices and nothing else, but humidity left on a company's balance sheet, because they didn't invest in technology, that they didn't do any R&D, they didn't diversify their businesses, they didn't buy up new businesses that could have made them better returns in affiliated businesses. And so there was a philosophy, there was an ideology of quarterly stock gains at any price, especially in the last couple of years, where even Donald Trump was touting this. His mark of success was the stock market. The stock market was his confirmation of doing a good job.
And he set the policy, right?
You said it.
So yeah, geez. So well, all those gains are gone now, so, and he's not
Yeah, pretty much.
reelected.
The gains of his administration are wiped out up till about right now. That's right, including what's going to happen tonight.
Yeah. So I guess shifting gears a little bit from the financial stuff. So, one thing that you talked about already on this podcast is how important it is to invest in 5G and AI and blockchain and IoT and all these future technologies. And one thing that you were saying to me a few days ago was that, this is what I've been working on for years, and yet all my clients care about right now is coronavirus. This is the big thing that's on everyone's minds. So I guess just to pick out 5G, because it is such an impactful technology, if you had to make the case to someone that even giving all this chaos, that this is still the right time to invest in 5G, that your investments in 5G can't be impacted by all the chaos going on, How would you make that case? Do you think that 5G, specifically just this technology, do you think it's still as important given everything that's happened the last 2 months?
Well, I think that, what we're seeing in China is after this, what China's looking pretty smart now. It was not looking very smart, 2 months ago. Now it's looking pretty smart because it's coming out of a very severe crackdown, which
Mm-hmm.
people, said could only happen in a totalitarian state. Well, guess what? Italy and Spain are doing exactly what China is doing, and England is doing exactly what China is doing, and many states are now doing exactly what China is doing. And so
Mm-hmm.
now that China is coming out of this nightmare, and it's starting to get back to normal, we hear a lot of news out of China that Shanghai is normalizing, Hangzhou is
Mm-hmm.
normalizing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou is normalizing. There's still a restricted labor movement, but the local economies are to some extent normalizing. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing to remember. This too shall end. I think within a year we'll probably have a vaccine for this thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know, and then you have to have one of two things: a vaccine; b, you have to have a large pockets of immune people, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who've had this become immune to it again.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have large pockets of immune people, people stop getting sick. That's the way viruses work,
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the two things that will help. And then of course, distancing is what everyone's working on at the moment. But I think it will be a very difficult thing for the next couple of months in the United States. But that doesn't mean that you stop doing all the things that nations do, which is,
Mm-hmm.
operate healthcare systems, maintain technology, maintain the infrastructure, maintain
Mm-hmm.
the food supply, maintain logistical supply, maintain your ports, right? Maintain law and order. Countries go on. And I think 5G is still a really vital part of the new infrastructure. And right now, China is way ahead of the US in that. It already implemented 5G last year in November, and the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. has yet to really implement any, real 5G network. And of course, I think this virus now is, obviously, as you mentioned, priority number one, and there's no other priorities except the virus and attacking the virus and saving people's lives. And that was China, 8 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
yes, of course, these technologies are vital. They're going to continue. China has had huge initiatives coming out. You should see the initiatives coming out of China. I watched them very carefully. China's doing a tremendous
Mm-hmm.
amount of technological initiatives, even as they were fighting the virus. They have done
Right.
spectacular banking reforms and insurance reforms while they're fighting the virus. It's pretty impressive. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
news on what Huawei's up to. Huawei's releasing a new phone today, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so China's not messing around. China's still going pretty much full bore in all these other technologies, and I think the U.S. will get back to normal as well, probably in the summertime, when these
Mm-hmm.
two things happen. When the vaccine begins to be properly distributed, I don't know when that's going to be, and when larger pockets of people create immunity,
Mm-hmm.
so that the virus stops spreading.
Yeah, because I just remember something that stuck out of me is that when the virus was spreading, all these AI companies in China were jumping out, and they were making algorithms that could identify faces behind masks. That was the big concern. And later, that technology was used pretty extensively for stuff like contact tracing,
Yes.
and it may have contributed to the control there, to controlling the situation pretty quickly there. And
Yes, and I
so,
just today
yeah.
Baidu released uh, a cell phone evolution of the entire spread of the virus
Hmm.
globally, starting in Wuhan at the street corner where that fish market was. It's really
Hmm.
remarkable graphic to show what's going
Hmm.
on through virtually any cell phone that was operating in Wuhan, and seeing where those cell
Hmm.
phones went. So it's these technological evolution is astounding. And of course, and everyone knows all the story now that people getting home delivery of everything in their whole lives, their household goods, their white goods, their food, their
Hmm.
fast food, their groceries, everything is basically And I think, there was tens of millions of people that got onto Alibaba that were never on Alibaba before because of the virus. And so Alibaba has tens of millions of more new customers that it didn't have before. And so,
Mhm.
so this is a commonly known, story that you're so right that the evolution in algorithms. I think the evolution in technological elements of healthcare are going to make huge um, strides in terms of the AI analysis of like RNA
Mhm.
strands. I think that's going to be a new science coming out of this that really didn't exist before. So I think we're going to get a lot of great stuff out of this. We have to look on the
Mhm.
on the other
On the
side
bright
of this
side.
darkness right now.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of what BlackRock did around the GFC, where they went around kind of picking up houses for pennies. And then 10 years later, they were the largest landowner, the largest house owner in the US and hugely profitable from that strategy. It's almost like that, but on a national scale, where if you can invest or keep your investments in all these emerging technologies in the right areas, then once we're over all this, God willing, in a few years, then it'll put you on a big head start while everyone else is just kind of shutting down and just you're just kind of staying in place.
That's right. That's right. You have to preserve your cash in order to do this, and then B, you have to be clever about what's out there that's got value to it. But you're right. You're absolutely right. A
Mhm.
lot of people made a great deal of money. But one thing we don't want to go around sort of the Schadenfreude is delighting in other people's misfortune and sort of
Right.
wringing our hands with greedily looking for opportunities to take advantage of people's misfortune. But
Right.
that's the way markets work, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if anyone wants to figure out what to invest in, then your book kind of goes into all this in great detail. And I think it's a really great kind of roadmap to what the future is going to look like and what we should do when we get there. And yeah, I think it's a really great tool to kind of wrap your head around all this stuff because there's a lot of going on in future technology too. Even before the virus.
Indeed, 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 indeed. And I think that anybody who had any question marks about whether they should be online, boy oh boy, that question's been answered.
Oh
And
yeah.
so this is why you've seen a big outperformance of Alibaba stock price, for instance. Even Tencent, which has been a
Mhm.
laggard relative to Alibaba, has done very well as well because of the online gaming, which we're all doing while we're sitting at home twiddling our thumbs in this sort of
Yeah.
self-imposed quarantine. You in Osaka and me in Singapore.
Yeah. Yeah. Plenty. Gotta fill your day somehow with activities. Probably why we're doing this podcast. But so to kind of combine these topics of new technologies and finance. So one thing that has been really interesting to me is that over the last few days you've seen a pretty big rout in the U.S. stock market. You saw U.S. Treasuries going bidless for hours one of these days. Um, Same deal happening in Europe. Same deal to a slightly less degree in China. You saw the ruble kind of dropping pretty dramatically. Now, Bitcoin also dropped very dramatically a few weeks ago. Went from 8,000 down to a low of 3,800. But
Yeah.
since then, since those 2 days of drops, it's kind of recovered, and right now it's hovering around 6,000. Now, obviously, that's a very short amount of time, and it's still a 20% drop. Going from 8,000 to 6,000, which, by the way, in crypto land is actually not that dramatic. But so what are your views here? Why it's almost like besides the first 2 days where I guess people are maybe panic selling Bitcoin and trying to do everything they could to get to USD. It's almost like since then Bitcoin has become less correlated to the rest of the market, and obviously it's not going to be that affected by any Fed bailouts. It's almost its own system. So what are your views there? How do you think crypto is going to be impacted by this chaos in the non-crypto markets?
Well, I think that if you look at all the players in the crypto market, I think that the drop that in crypto that coincided with the drop in equities and this rout in bond land, I
Hmm.
think it tells us that there was a lot of leverage in the crypto among crypto players. In other words, The same thing happened in crypto land that was happening in equity land, and that was a margin call. That people who borrowed money, right, to buy an asset, and then when that asset price goes down, the bank gives them a call and taps on the shoulder and says, hey, you know what? We need more cash in your account, or we're going to liquidate your holdings on your behalf, right? So banks have and brokers have the right to do that. And so I think there was a lot of forced liquidation in crypto land for exactly the same reason that there was forced liquidation in equity land. And that was a margin call as the collateral price was going down. And so we always want to be poking around and asking questions and finding out. For people who are new, younger people who are new, it's vital to figure out how much leverage is in the system of crypto players. That's a very vital question at all times. I wonder if a lot of the leverage is washed out. Question mark. It seems to me, and looking at some of the price action, that maybe some of the leverage is washed out.
Yeah, because, I don't know if you were watching, but there was some research there was some blockchain. People were looking at on-chain transactions right before the massive sell-off, and they found that there was a shift of 281,000 Bitcoin. And the majority of these were from addresses that had been created less than 30 days ago. So these were not long-term holders. These were not day-to-day holders. These were short-term holders, and it was a massive amount of Bitcoin. And a lot of this was transferred into exchanges. Now, 281,000 Bitcoin at a price of 8,000 per Bitcoin is $2.2 billion. And so that certainly there has been correlation in the past to large moves on the blockchain and large surges or rises in the price of Bitcoin. So, I don't think everything we can say now is just speculative, but it does seem there is evidence that someone was moving around a huge amount of Bitcoin right before, or a group of people right before the crash. And obviously, everyone's favorite bogeyman for these kind of things in crypto land are miners. Everyone thinks that they're the puppet masters. Another kind of possible culprit is Plus Token, which was a huge Ponzi scheme in China last year, which also had roughly that amount of Bitcoin in illicit earnings. So it might have been them cashing out. One theory I've heard is, like you said, a large fund is liquidating their Bitcoin position, which would make sense because that's, certainly U.S. fund would want to get back to USD as quickly as possible if they're that bearish. So, I don't know. It could have been any of these things. It's always hard to say in crypto land. But, I do think it was someone either manipulating or them getting squeezed and having to get their positions out.
What date was that? What do you remember? What day? What week that was?
I don't have it on hand right now. I'll send it to you after.
Like was it late January or early February or?
I believe it was. You know what? Let me just find it right now. I believe it was late February.
Okay.
That's what I think it was, but I'm not 100% sure. I think it was right before we saw this huge drop. I'll have to find that.
Well, one of the things that makes people, especially people on Main Street, furious is that sometime during February, the Senate Intelligence Committee, in a secure room, was given a briefing by people in the U.S. Army intelligence. And they were saying basically that a pandemic was an absolute inevitability and you better prepare for this. And of course, those people never said anything, but two of them are under investigation for selling all of their holdings. Right? And so this is the kind of thing that gets out to the elite, right? The elite get access to their senators. The senators start to talk about certain elite members of their inner circle. And then these people can, buy Bitcoin or try to, get out of a certain currency into something of a safe haven. And so some of this could have been a response to, information that they received on the nature of the spread of the virus before a lot of the community knew it, and when many leaders of many countries were telling everybody to go out drinking and have a good time.
Right. Right. And that's a whole other can of worms around governance, right? It's like I saw Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, she was talking about how senators or public servants should not hold stock, which I don't agree with. I don't see why people can't hold stock, but
They should, but in a
obviously
blind trust. They should have a blind
right.
trust. They can hold all they want, anything they want, in a blind trust that they don't know
Yeah,
what's in there.
because we have procedures for this kind of stuff. If you're gonna liquidate, put out your liquidation plan over the next 12 months, make it public. Wait 3 months to do anything. That's how we know, right, that you're not trading on insider information, and you just go through it. Or like you said, put in a blind trust. I think Senator Kelly Loeffler. I think that her case was that her money was managed by asset managers. She had no knowledge of what was happening. If they sold, that was not because of her insider information, which may or may not be true. Obviously, it's hard to prove now that, because she didn't just, well, I don't know what she did with her money, but it certainly looks bad at the very least. But yeah, these kind of things, it's, it becomes tricky, right? It's an issue of how we want to. It's the same deal of what's happening today with people, the Democrats and the Republicans fighting over this bill. You shove this thing in there. Um, is it a good thing for Democrats to try to push it through, given the blank check, or is it not? Once these things happen, all these issues of civic governance really start to come up as well.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that plus I think the cosmetics of this, the public image of what would be happening just by giving a blank check to the Treasury Department and then having 3 senators and Trump and Mnuchin divide up who gets the money, just it sort of stinks to high heavens, and that's why I think the Democrats said, well, thanks very much. In fact, the message that they gave last night, several hours ago, was, we're going to go back and have our own bill. Thank you very much. We're not even interested in trying to clean up this one. We're going to do our own. And so there's a wide distance between the two parties at the moment on exactly this issue, on the issue of image and what this looks like and what it could lead to, and the perception of corruption.
Yeah, and you were just talking about a little bit earlier about how U.S. society is not the most cohesive it's ever been right now, and that's it's not like the Japanese in that way. This could turn out different, but we'll see.
Yeah, if you try to bail out,
It's going to be an interesting
the
time.
corporates on Wall Street, and you don't bail out the little guy, they'll go bananas. They'll go bonkers and do something very irrational. People will lose it.
Yeah.
And so they don't want to do that.
Yeah. Well, I guess my last question for now, unless there's anything else you think we should cover, is just this on this topic of the little guy, of the the average person. I guess let's just talk about people in the U.S. Then, what do you think that, given everything we talked about, given all the chaos that's going to come, what do you think that they should do for the next month or so? I mean, obviously, stay at home, wash your hands, don't go out. But what about after that? Should they be using this time to study up on AI and try to get a job as an engineer after? Should they be considering a move to Singapore? Given like a 12-month time frame, what do you think are some things that people should start considering? Post.
So the answers are everything from which I just learned from my niece yesterday. When there was a plague at Cambridge, Isaac Newton worked at home for 2 years when he was 23 years old. He created differential calculus. When there was a plague and Shakespeare was stuck working at home, he wrote Macbeth and King Lear. I have many interns right now who are shut in. Their universities are closed. Their classes are canceled. They're going to get a pass-fail. They're looking for jobs. I tell them, 2 things. One, stay focused. Learn a skill. Occupy your time well. Discipline your time. Get up in the morning. Take a shower. Create structure in your life. On the other one, it's very important to show compassion, show love, volunteer, help somebody else. Talk about what's happening with you to your friends. Make dinners for people. Make dinners together. Talk about the problems while you're making dinners. Help the elderly by distributing food. Let's become a community again. These are the things that are happening in front of our eyes that are great. It's happening in Spain, it's happening in Italy, it's happening with people I'm talking to who are my interns from, in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Virginia and California, and it's great. And then thirdly, one of the great points that was made by UNICEF, this is not a one-off trauma. This is not a car accident or a fire. This is an ongoing trauma that we're seeing a lot of death around us. And so we have to be really vigilant for our mental health and talk about these issues and practice mindfulness and get some of these mindfulness apps and try to learn a little bit of meditation and quiet time and and reaching out to some higher power. These are very vital things. So yes, we want to exercise the mind and learn new skills, but we also want to exercise the the heart in these kinds of things. This is a vital part to help us all heal from what is a very traumatic, once in a century event right now. And I'm afraid it's going to get quite unpleasant in many metropolitan cities, including New York City, as you and I discussed recently. I think there's going to be a lot of very problematic situations in hospitals all across the 5 boroughs of New York that are going to be very messy. And so we just have to get ready for that.
Yeah, especially New York City. Jesus Christ. God bless them. But yeah, there was actually one more thing I wanted to ask you. It's kind of a big topic, so one thing that we were talking about even before this was the impact of climate change and how after 50 years, after 70 years, climate change has finally caught up with us. And so even before the coronavirus, the big thing that to me was kind of, that this is the time when things are going to start change was the fires in Australia and the fires in Indonesia and the fires in Canada and the fires in other places, but especially the fires in Australia and the Amazon. And so, climate change is catching up to us, I think, with some of the responses from these governments were that in the UK and the US are starting to just give out what is basically a universal basic income to people. I think we really start to see the fragility of having overly concentrated supply chains and to some degree the fragility of having an overly specialized global economy. People are, for the first time in years, really taking a month off to just chill and just sit and be still and I guess rethink their lives if they want to. All these things are happening. The coronavirus is forcing us to do all these things. And these were things that needed to happen and were going to happen beforehand. But the coronavirus is forcing these things to happen now. So, given we talked about how short-sighted the regime is in forcing stockholders to demand stock buybacks, because I think it is in their rational interest, even if it is very, very short-sighted. Given how we talked about these senators were getting inside information and may
It's
have
not
some inside
rational, it's
information.
greedy. I disagree with you.
It's
It's not
greedy. It's
rational.
greedy.
It's just pure greed that you can get that much of a tax saving by driving a stock price up. It's a cheap, greedy gimmick. I'm sorry. It's not rational. It's foolish.
You
It's
know what?
extremely
I think
foolish
that's a good point.
policy.
Mhm.
But in
So let me rephrase that then. Given how our current society would view that kind of greed as rational, right? How it would view those kind of actions as being responsible to shareholders. Given that now that society is shut down, how do you think society and governments and the way that we relate to people and the way the economy works, how do you think that's going to change once this is all over?
Yeah, I think it's changing already. I think the people in power in the UK, US, Italy, um, other regimes that tend to be on the right side, believe in more of a plutocracy, responding to corporate interests. That volunteerism can take care of problems in society. The government shouldn't be involved in this. It's just a bunch of rubbish. That this will teach people to say, you know what? Yeah, the federal government should be involved in state health care. Guess what? This is important, and the federal government's going to have to get involved in emergency relief. It's going to have to get involved in disease research. It's going to have to get involved in viral vaccines. It's going to have to get involved in keeping the CDC funded. It's going to have to get involved in making sure that FEMA is well funded. It's going to have to get involved in making sure that hospitals can function properly. And so I think that this administration in Washington is basically swallowing its ideological pride, and is going to have to do a lot of things that they find odious according to their ideological preferences, and move far more to the left in terms of responding to people's needs. A lot of kids in America, they go to school for lunch. There are no lunches for millions of kids right now. The federal government's going to have to help. The federal government's going to have to help create tents for people as the hospitals overflow. The federal government's going to have to create, subsidies for people. And I believe, by the way, we're going to have, I was just reflecting this morning, I think we're going to spend $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus after this $2 trillion. There's going to be a lot more to come, because there's going to be a lot of pain out there, and there's going to be a really high unemployment rate. And so you're going to have to keep the fiscal, you're going to have to keep the fiscal, game going for quite a long time. And I think the Federal Reserve is going to be forced to purchase corporate bonds for the first time ever in a public way, and it's going to have to explain this to the public. And as long as the public gets, things like this, they will swallow their anger and allow corporates to get a bailout. But boy, oh boy, the corporates better be given second fiddle to a middle-class bailout, or there's going to be really big problems. And I think the Democratic Party understands that now. The Democrats didn't get that in 2008. Now they get it.
Yeah. What a failed opportunity back then. But so here's the part that always kind of mystifies me, because everything you talked about, a $5 trillion stimulus, right? The verbiage that we use when we call it a stimulus, we mean it to be a one-time thing. We're going to stimulate it, it's going to get better, and then we're going to stop. The verbiage back when LTCM was bailed out was, this is a one-time thing, it's never going to happen again. And then 2008, this is a one-time thing, this is temporary, we're going to have some temporary QE, and then we're going to stop. And now we're talking about, well, now we need 2 trillion, maybe 5 trillion of stimulus. And then we're talking about giving out UBI, we're talking about socialized healthcare, we're talking about better funding for, for agencies like CDC. We're talking about a lot of things that are not temporary, that are really, permanent changes to certainly how we budget. And I think if we keep using verbiage, if we keep talking about it as stimulus, then it's almost like our society as it stands doesn't have the vocabulary to talk about this kind of stuff in an accurate way. That's not set up to think about, well, what if we just gave everyone, what if we stopped these bailouts and just gave people money from now until the end of time? What if we started, what if we ventured into, I guess, modern monetary theory, where the government should be the backstop, the government should be funding all these things, and it's okay because, as they say, I'm not going to pretend to understand MMT, but they're certainly perfectly fine with running huge deficits until the end of time. So I guess my question is, I feel like there's a fundamental mismatch. Everyone treats these things, the Republicans treat these things as, we're just going to give everyone money until the virus is over. But but it's not over, right? These things happen because these societies were not set up to handle these things, because they weren't investing in these kind of things. How do you think we're gonna resolve that kind of mismatch between what we expected up to now and what seems to work at the moment? And do you think that's gonna, it's almost like a cultural mismatch. How do you think that's gonna happen? Do you think it's gonna happen?
Well, I think that if you think of the alternative, which is to say, you know what, we can't do this anymore. We can't be throwing money around. We have to be responsible. We have to, engage in austerity. We have to let things fail. That was the prevailing philosophy after the Great Depression in 1929. The Republicans back then were basically saying, the government shouldn't be involved in this, let the market clear, let the market find a clearing price, let stocks fall. And, that led to mass unemployment and World War II, and 50 million people died. Now, that did not work out so well. That was not a great solution, right?
Right.
Right. You want to avoid global war and the deaths of 50 million people. And so this is what, people are trying to deal with now, is to say, whatever we spend and we throw into an economy is basically money that just is going to be going through the machine, right? It's just going to be spent. It's basically, going from the right pocket to the left pocket. And I think there is sort of an element of Keynesian theory is that, right? That the money can keep going through in the machine. If you stop the debt machine for a period of time, you will get I guarantee you'll get a depression that will make 1929 look like a garden party, right? And so that's not a very good option. And so I think people who talk like that have no idea what they're talking about. So libertarians who think the market should find its own clearing price are out of their minds.
Yeah. So, it sounds like if the Republicans are able to work through the reasoning, then it almost sounds like the inevitable conclusion is we're going to have to, a Republican president is going to have to propose like a new deal, right, within the next few months to sustain the recovery that we're somehow able to salvage out of all this.
That's exactly what's happening today in the Congress right now. That's exactly what's being offered is a new deal to bail out corporates, but also to bail out the middle class with a $2,000 check, with unemployment benefits, with work at home benefits, with babysitting, with lunches, health care, free free health care for the virus treatment, for the virus tests, all that. That is exactly what that is. Right? And there's an old saying, it's capitalism on the way up, socialism on the way down. And with that, let's, until next time, right?
Yeah, who would have thought Trump would have been the most socialist president since FDR? Well,
we'll have to see. We'll have to see.
Yeah. Cool. Well, unless you got anything else you want to talk about, well, thanks so much for being on here, Paul. It's a lot to think about. It's very interesting.
A lot of food for thought. Thank you so much. This has been great. We got to do this again.
We should.
Okay, perfect, my friend.
Man, talk to you soon.
Thanks. Great. Bye.